Hello and welcome to the AMPLIFY Show. I'm Emily Raquette, former TV news reporter turned media entrepreneur. I've spent my entire career shining a spotlight on inspiring people doing incredible things. In each episode, I share an interview or message to help you amplify your business and your life. Thanks for joining me and get ready to amplify. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited about today's episode, aren't I always? But this one is really cool because when I was expecting my first daughter, my cousin gave me a book to read. And I read some of it in the first year, but it wasn't until about a year or two ago, so when my daughter was 3 or 4 years old, that I really read it cover to cover, and it blew me away. It is now my go-to book I give to all new parents. It's called Simplicity Parenting, Using the Extraordinary Power of Less to Raise Calmer, Happier, and More Secure Kids. And the author has a new book out now called Being at Your Best When Your Kids Are at Their Worst. That sounds pretty good, right? So check the show notes. I'm linking to both there. But even better, I'm sharing the conversation that I recently had with the author, Kim John Payne himself. He has worked with children and families around the world, and you're about to hear some of his fascinating research. He's worked as a counselor, an educator, and as an author, he's given a voice to people probably like you and me who have this feeling that something is not okay about this new normal of overwhelm, of doing more, being more, and this fast-paced life with too much stuff, too many choices, and too little time. And one that Kim John Payne says is waging an undeclared war on childhood. And we also talk about doable ways to instill hope and deep connection with our children, how to de-escalate using humor. That's a tool I have found so much use out of. And overall, I just hope you find this valuable and you can use these tools to amplify both your business and your life. So with that, let's dive in.
I got started in this in a rather sort of peculiar way, really, because working in a group home for struggling kids. A lot of them were coming from the courts, had done all kinds of stuff, mainly around violent crime. I saw stress, firsthand. I lived and worked in this group home, so it was a highly stressed environment. And I was taking courses during the day at college, and at the nighttime I was in the group home. And I came across a guy there who had been a medic in the Korean War, graduated, became a doctor in the Australian Army in the Vietnam War, and then later took further training into psychiatry. Fascinating guy. He was talking about what we now know as PTSD. And the more he talked about PTSD and the symptoms of nervousness and of jumpy, hypervigilant, fight, flight, freeze, and I added to that flock, by the way, because I was working with gang members. The more he talked about combat veterans that weren't doing well, the more I started lining that up with kids in my group home. He was talking about them, only they weren't combat veterans. I didn't realize that set a life course of just wondering about this, what's going on. And then later, when I worked in refugee camps all around the world, first up was the Thai-Cambodian refugee camps at the end of the Vietnam War. I saw nervous, jumpy, hypervigilant, over-controlling kids who couldn't adapt easily to new situations. And but I could get my mind around that because these kids were from combat zones. But then when I moved to the United Kingdom to study trauma and stress in childhood, I opened up a little counselling practice, really, west of London, but regular kids, mixed cultural, mixed socioeconomic backgrounds. And through the door came wartime kids. I'd just been in a war zone, and these kids looked like they were coming out of a war zone. Nervous, jumpy, hypervigilant, over control, all the stuff, all the same stuff. These kids were living in the undeclared war on childhood. There was something going on in their lives which was under the radar, but unrelenting, ongoing stress. And that was the clue to it. It wasn't wartime stress, high volume, high velocity, which is shocking and awful. This was more under the radar, and it led them to showing much of the same symptoms, and the problem with it is that it was becoming the new normal. And that's what set me off on this course, gosh, almost 30 years ago now. So that's a big answer to a reasonable question. But anyway, it's your fault because you asked.
It really is. I opened up that can of worms. You said the undeclared war on childhood. And over the course of 30 years since then, have you seen a massive shift in awareness? Have you seen changes? Has this gotten worse? Where are we at currently?
I've seen it get worse, and I've seen our consciousness of it get better. So on one hand, I mean, this is back in the sort of late 70s, right through to the mid 80s, right at the time I was just talking about. There wasn't even an iPhone. Well, there wasn't even an iPhone 15 years ago, So we're talking about a time that was significantly slower. So yes, the pace of life, this too much, too soon, too sexy, too young, it's gotten way more intense than it was 20, 25 years ago. I think any parent would testify to that. Our kids have to cope with so much more than most of us as parents ever had to cope with. And so the intensity of it definitely has increased. The data that I quote in the Simplicity Parenting book, particularly in the new, the second edition, which is about to come out in 6 to 8 months, I've updated all the research because I wanted to check that question out as well, actually, because my hunch was, this has increased, but the data also points very conclusively to it as well. So that has increased, but meanwhile, more and more parents are getting onto it. They're realizing that this is not sustainable. We just can't keep doing this. Our family life, we just feel like, unpaid Uber drivers, or actually most Uber drivers are unpaid, but you know what I mean. It's increasing, but many parents are saying, hang on, we've got to make a shift here.
Absolutely. So when I read your book, there were so many parts that just really touched me. And you so beautifully say what I and thousands of other parents are feeling in our hearts, that we are trying our hardest and we are overanalyzing every little detail of how we're supposed to raise our kids, the lives we're supposed to set them up for. And in doing so, we're actually sabotaging ourselves and their futures because we're fighting nature in a lot of ways. So talk to us a little bit about that, what you see, what we're doing, and what we should be letting go.
Well, one of the criticisms of the approach, of my approach to just simplifying and balancing, in home life is, that was great back in the 50s and 60s. But now we've got to do this. Everyone is doing it, like soccer on Monday, ballet on Tuesday, soccer on Wednesday, psychotherapy on Thursday to cope with it all. And then Friday, we're back into play dates. There's just, and that's become ubiquitous. It's just become, like I said, the new normal. And we've got to do that now. That's just what is. I asked a friend of mine who's an evolutionary neurologist. I said, the brain would adapt of kids, right? They'd be able to cope with this. Isn't the brain adapting? And she said, probably, yeah, let me do some research. And so she looked into it. A couple of weeks later, she got back to me and said, good news, bad news. I said, okay, what is it? And she said, well, the good news is the brain would adapt. And I said, great. And she said, don't you want to ask me the bad news? And I said, I was hoping not to, really. But, and she said, 900 years. I said, what do you mean? She said, we've got 900 years ahead of the brain's ability to cope with this. If we kept stress off the kids, the average 12-year-old is experiencing right now. She had the average, the N data, the normative data. The brain would catch up. So our kids, if they lived to being 900 years old and stayed at the age of 12, they'd be fine. So we have gotten way ahead of our kids' ability to adapt. But the criticism is, but that's just the way the world is. At our gut level, at an instinctual level, we know something's wrong. We know something is up. It just doesn't feel right at all. And I think that's why Simplicity Parenting has reached so many people. That's why, it's one of the I don't say this to be self-grandizing, but it's one of the biggest selling parenting books now for the last 10 years. And it's an ugly little book. I mean, you've seen it. It's got a terrible photograph on the cover. It's the writing small, the paper's nat. I mean, everything is, like, really, how does this book do? But it's because I think it's speaking, like you mentioned, to us at a gut level. And that is, a parent, our job is to provide and protect. And if we've got this pull and push going on, because as people, as out there in the workplace, we want to provide, and that's getting harder to do. But we also want to protect. And there's this instinctual feeling of our kids and our family life is just not, it's just not what we hoped for. It's just not what we want as parents. And I think that's why dialing it back has touched so many people, actually.
Yeah. I mean, that resonates with me so much because my first couple years as a mom, even you look at birthday parties or the Pinterest worthy birthday parties, and you can plan this till you're blue in the face. And, with the birthday party, at the end of it all, I would feel, wow, was I there? Was I present? Did I experience this moment, or was I putting on a show for everyone else and what really mattered to my child? And I think that's how a lot of people are feeling in this movement really that you've really helped create, is to kind of boycott this modern idea of parenting, that things don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be pretty. They don't have to be busy, certainly not busy. I do not subscribe to that belief of putting my child in all the dance classes and all of the play dates and having them reading at a certain age and checking all the boxes. I'd love to know your take on even just the public school system when it comes to that, because I do think as that's changed, it's had a massive impact on how kids are raised, but it is what the majority of people can afford and do. They just trust that must be the best way.
Mm-hmm. When you're saying, you're wary or even boycotting, this like supersized family life, but probably what you experienced is what I experienced too, being a dad of two kids. You got to be pretty strong, right? How did you go when you did that, when you decided, okay, we're not buying into this? How did it go for you, if I may ask?
Well, it's been a bit of an evolution, and I still question myself all the time, because there will be very well-meaning people in my life or in our lives, and they're very smart, and they may question it or ask about certain standards that my daughter should be at, or are they doing these things yet? Oh, it's about time they start doing this activity or this type of skill. And it makes me question myself. So it's this consistent reminder. And I'll tell you, it's a bit of a leap of faith too, because we only get this one shot over their childhood. And I do sometimes think if you pick the wrong path, you can't start over once they're 15, 16, 17, once this has really become a part of who they are. You can't go back in time and change that conditioning. Like it or not, it's happening. I think it's really hard to know if you're doing the right thing. There's not a ton of validation. Young kids will still have their tantrums. They're still learning to test limits. Is it healthy? Is it not? Is it something that I should change what I'm doing? So I think if anything, there's just, there's too much information out there for parents, and yet you just don't know what the right information is and which ones to trust, and then to know, are you doing the right thing? So I don't know how it's been going for me, to answer a long answer to your question.
I think that you and I are both perfectly typical. We're of a very large group. We don't really know, but what we do know is that when we live a simple and balanced life, we're living closer to our values as a family. And if you raise a kid on your family values, they can't really go wrong. I was watching my daughter, two daughters actually, down at, I live near Boston, and I was watching them down at the airport 6 months ago, and they're both, as luck would have it, leaving Boston, one going to Europe for an exchange for an extended period of time, the other one going to Australia to live and explore the world. They're 18 and 20 years old, and off they go. And I'm watching them, right? And it's moving because there they are, backpacks. And one of the things I'm watching them help each other out, the older ones helping the younger one out, and they're best friends, you know. And I turn to my wife, Catherine, and say, you know, we may have got a lot wrong, but they're besties. And that's got to be good. That's got to be worth it. They've been close. They've done a lot of stuff together because we didn't have a lot of stuff going on outside the house. So they're good friends. Okay, so that's one thing. But secondly, they're going off into the world, and there's a lot of stuff that's going to come at them. You know, we know that. And what I'm hoping is that all those hours, for example, they weren't on screens. Think of the 10,000 hours thing, you know, to be good at something, 10,000 hours. I did the math recently, and if a child is even half the national average of watching screens, okay, the national average now is 11 and a half hours per day per child. That's the Kaiser Family Foundation study, 11 and a half hours per day that they're not with a family, right? Now, even if I halve that really generously, and I did the math on that over the period of my kids' lives when most kids would start watching TV, computers, phones and such, it came to about 15,000 hours that they've spent with their family, us, that they've spent climbing trees, spent building forts, spent building really crazy projects and things that they've got going on, and 15,000 hours. Now, when they're walking across that concourse, stepping onto airplanes, out they go into their own lives. Do I want that 15,000 hours to have been building, constructing, being friends with family, or do I want it just being busy and doing nothing much and even just watching television? That's 15,000 hours right there. So I think we can have confidence. And the other thing I would add to that is when I was updating the Simplicity Parenting book, I came across a really interesting piece of research that it goes back 3 years, but in 2016, that's the newest data I could find, over 32% of all millennial employment was freelance, self-employed, or project-based and non-benefited. Right, so there was no benefits associated, and I did the math from 2006 to 16 to 26. When a lot of our kids, if we've got little kids, that's when they'll be in the workplace. And given the present curve, that will rise to way over 50% of all employment will be self-employed. Now, anyone who's been self-employed or working in the corporate world where it's almost a sort of a self-employment-like environment where, you know, there's targets to make, will know that to in that kind of work environment, you've got to be really innovative, right? You've got to be really adaptable, self-motivated. What else would you say? What are the qualities that you've come across? Because you come across a lot of working mums in the workforce. So I would start off with innovative, adaptable, creative. What would you add to that?
All of those things. You have to have a thick skin. You're very strong-willed. You have vision.
Vision, yeah.
Forward-thinking vision. I'm always trying to look 10 steps ahead and then backtrack, reverse engineer how to get there. Since we're on this topic, so I was going to point out, to give my children a simple life, it's not easy. I work, and my husband and I work very hard just so we can create this simple, easy life. Like, you have to work very hard to afford a certain level of childcare and ease and support to ensure your children aren't on screens and they're going to the best schools that support your values and aren't necessarily the mainstream schools that are concerned about standardized testing. And then I find that can be in conflict, because the more I work toward being able to build this life for them, it means the more I'm working and the more I'm focused on it. And so it's kind of this battle between letting go of some of my expectation for success in life so that I can be present and truly be there and model that lifestyle for my children, while also hustling and working really hard to ensure I can give them the very best life possible that on the outside looks quite simple. And I think that's the big secret, that to have this type of life, it can take a lot of work and resources.
Well, that's, it's so beautifully put, Emily, because there's the tension right there, right? That's the tension. And if 50% of kids, and this is where I would, come full circle with this. If when our kids, if they're graduating college, like after 2026, the numbers are only increasing, that they're going to have to be self-reliant, creative, forward-looking. I really like that pitch you gave, of forward-looking, and then you reverse engineer it. That's such a great way of looking at it. But all those qualities that we just named are involved in simple downtime. They're involved in play. They're involved in giving kids unstructured time. You think about a kid building a fort, out in the yard or down the park or wherever, and you think about a kid, a child doing something like that. They have this, let's just take a fort, you're on somewhere, you're on vacation, you're down the beach, and they're gathering all this stuff and driftwood, and they're building a fort. And but what they're doing is that they've had this idea of what they want, and then they reverse engineer it, just exactly like you said. That's where they myelinate that part of their brain. A big part of my interest has been in child's neurological development. And what you mentioned with that reverse engineering, it was such a really insightful comment, if I may say, is that they learn that through us giving them space for childhood. They don't learn that through all these activities so much, of course, a little bit, but they're highly structured. Our kids are moving into a rapidly destructuring world. So simplicity and balance in a child's life is not about wanting to go back into the 1950s. It's about the world they're going into. And us working parents, because both my wife and I work as well, and my wife's a teacher, and my goodness, those people work long, long hours, Nice. It's the world our kids are going into that we prepare them when we give them a simple and balanced life. And then comes the dilemma that you mentioned, which is, but hang on, in order to, like, let's say we don't want to buy into the No Child Left Intact Act. All right, I never miss an opportunity to diss that. Where high stakes testing, super stressed stuff going on at schools, the race to the bottom, that sort of stuff. Some of us are stuck with it, or some of us believe in public education. Others of us believe, are looking for alternatives through Montessori, through Waldorf schools, and so on. I mean, it's very individual, but I guess the balance, and this for me is where, when I work in the corporate world and work with parent affinity groups, and I work with parent affinity groups in tons of corporations. So I've never been employed by a corporation or large businesses or large not-for-profits, but I visit them pretty regularly in these wonderful affinity groups. They're so great. And for me, the answer partly lies in the reality of working really, really hard now is just with us. Long hours, our work life is increased by over an hour and a half. We spend more than an hour and a half actively in the workplace than we did 10 years ago. But that doesn't even include the work following us home via our phones, and being on call so much. Remember, phones and computers were meant to make work life easier? Yeah, that was a major con, wasn't it? Anyway, so there we are. We've got less time with our kids. So for me, the key to it is that time, it's not, I don't think of that as anything other than just having simple, connected time together. That's not quality time. It's not quantity time. It's connected time. So if we've got less time, and that's a reality for most of us, then the time we spend together, if we can clear the decks a little bit and just be together, just mess around, decompress, sit on the sofa, read stories, wrestle, be goofy, bake in the kitchen and make this horrible mess, get into a flower fight, water all over the floor, just whatever it is, even with teenagers, just having two almost post-teenage kids myself, just going into their rooms and sitting on a chair and reading a magazine while they're doing their homework. And then the conversation starts up. My daughter might look up and say, Dad, this thing about how we're supposed to, and then the conversation starts up just because I'm sitting in a chair. I'm not being the world's greatest parent. I'm sitting in a chair reading a book, whatever it is. If we've got less time, then let's clear the decks a little bit, simplify it so that we can be with our kids. So when they're walking across that concourse, getting onto an aeroplane, they're leaving with our values, the North Star of our values, not the magnetic north of toxic pop culture. They're leaving with something of us in place. And having been through that recently, that's near and dear to my heart.
That is beautiful. Comes full circle there. Tell us all about being at your best when your kids are at your worst. It's your latest book we can get our hands on. First, if you haven't read Simplicity Parenting, you can still read that. But tell us about your new book.
Yeah, the new book, I think it's the 6th book I've written. And honestly, that should have been the first, just real, true confessions. Because it starts with us. It's not about the kids. Mm-hmm. It's about how we can be better regulated when our kids are pressing our buttons, like every button on the control panel that we have. And this book, what it does is that it explores how we can be better centered, how we can be calmer, have better self-regulation when our kids have lost their regulation. It basically works on this theme that I wrote about this in another book, The Soul of Discipline, where I make this statement: I've never met a disobedient kid in my life. And I've met some right little rotters, I can tell you, being a school counselor. I really have. I've never met a disobedient kid. I've only ever met a disoriented one. And that's not just semantics. I really believe kids are disoriented. And when they're disoriented, they echolocate us. They ping us with their behavior. They send out their behavior. When little kids do something really naughty, and then they look right at you.
Yes, I am familiar with this.
You've had that one?
Oh, many times.
Right. Then what are they looking for? And I think what they're looking for, at least partly, if not mainly, is your reaction. Yeah. And via your reaction, they get their direction. They co-regulate, basically. They're feeling a little bit unsettled. They're feeling maybe they're hitting a little developmental shift. They're 2 years old. They're 5. They're 7.5. I mean, they're all 14. These are all developmental stages. 9 years of age is another one. So there's something shifting. They're feeling a little bit disquieted, and they'll try it on. Or we've moved home. We've shifted a job. Again, they're disoriented. And the biggest disorientation is life's moving too fast. I'm not coping as a child. I am not coping with all this pressure, all these play dates, all these clubs, all this stuff. And so they ping us. They echolocate. They send out not a sonic ping like a navigator does at sea, but they send out behavior. Now, when they send out behavior, if they meet someone who is relatively together, relatively centered and calm, not completely, of course, but then they are going to calm down a whole bunch quicker.
Real quickly, you talk about de-escalating with humor, and that is something I've read somewhere in your world. I don't know if it was in a book or one of your blogs or podcasts, but it is a tool that it is like my secret weapon when I realize this just isn't going to be worth the argument or worth worth the emotions, that is always in my back pocket. And I find that that works brilliantly. Do you have just a quick little tip or tool for parents who are listening on how to use humor?
Yeah, the thing that I've noticed about humor, and when I meet parents, because I do, these workshops in the business world, in, like big, business of little ones all the time, and I ask them about humor, the parents that are often the funniest, that can bring humor into their relationship, which just relieves the pressure. It's like a safety release valve, like a pressure release valve, are almost always the ones that are a little more relaxed. Now, because humor needs space, it's really hard to be genuinely, empathetically funny, not sarcastically funny, but empathetically funny, or self-effacing, but genuinely, not to a point where it's negative. What it needs is just that one or two heartbeats of self-regulation to see the funny side of things, to really be in a situation and see the funny side of things. It just takes a little bit of regulation. Can I give you a quick example?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is, there's so many. I know, I'll choose one from, I'll choose one at the top of the list of provocative situations.
Okay.
And to do this, I've got to choose a situation where it wasn't with my own kids. Okay, so I'm a school counselor, a lot of pressure. I walk out onto the field, and I hope this is not too graphic for your listeners, but there's a ninth grade girl with all these other girls surrounding her, and I think, and I see the kids, and I think, I think I'll wander over and see what's happening. They see me coming, and they just part the way, and there's a girl just in the middle of the group, and she has a baseball bat, and she's rolling a condom on and off the baseball bat.
Wow. Okay.
I know. She's 14 years old. And like my brain is going like the 4th of July. Like, where did she get that? What is she doing with that? Why is she doing it? And she's looking me right at me and doesn't stop, makes no attempt to hide it. Right. So in that moment, because I've practiced it, that's why I call this the compassionate response practice. That's the subtitle of the book. I've practiced many, many, many times not being reactive, because we practice for a tennis game, we practice for a musical event, whatever. And so I've trained myself, just as in the Being at Your Best book shows. It sort of gives those secrets of how you do that. And so I look at her, and I'm not in a reactive space. I hear the reactivity, I integrate it. I'm not perfect, like I said, but I integrate the reactivity, the outrage, because she's really looking at me provocatively.
Right.
Like, what are you going to do about this? And I say to her, Anna, wow, you must really want to have a safe hit.
Good one.
Just start falling about laughing, right? We're all laughing. And of course, I'm going to see this kid later in the day to check out what was going on.
Sure.
But in that moment, the humor let the air out of a very tense, potentially very tense situation. This girl had been suspended a few times. If I had gone in that direction, maybe she would have been expelled. It would have gone in a really bad direction.
It seems to me like you took the power out of the situation, because she was holding power or leverage over creating a bad situation. But because you didn't react, it couldn't become anything more. Isn't
that exactly what humor does? That it takes it what it does is it cuts across the who's in charge thing. It cuts across the I remember a child once said to me, well, you're no boss of me. Right? And I said to her, oh, gosh, Steffi, haven't you heard? And she said, what? And I said, I am. And the other kids laughed so much. She was 5 years old. And she was saying, you're no boss of me. Well, sweetheart, you're 5. And I am the boss. I have to be, because we're on a little school outing, and there are trucks and buses, and we had to get through this city, and I had to be the boss. That's what humor does, is that it offers us a chance to get out of a power struggle. It lets the air out of the situation, but honestly, to have the chance to find that little bit of a humorous moment means we've got to do something that I talk about actually in this book, where I talk about being on the dance floor, but being on the balcony. Like, parenting is all about being on the dance floor, like getting things done, getting the lunches ready, breakfast eaten in the car, get off to the bus. And there's all the dance floor metaphor. But we've also at our best when we're on the balcony, being more mindful, watching ourselves so that we can see stuff coming. We hold the big picture, because we are the emotional climate control in our homes, 100%. We are the emotional climate control. So if we can be on the balcony as stuff is going on, and we're aware of what's happening within the family, that's when humor can come in. That's when if a child's done something really challenging, one can either be very assertive or very soft, but the child, and I don't know if you've noticed this, Emily, but when kids are really naughty, they're almost always at their most vulnerable. Have you noticed that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tricky position to be in as a parent, because it's not so much, on one hand, it's not about the thing they did, but you want them to learn the lesson of the thing they did. But I always know in all these moments, it's about how our relationship is happening in that moment, to maintain trust, to teach them. If I don't want her to be yelling, I can't be just yelling back at her. If I don't want her to hit someone, I can't hit her. And it can be a challenge, though, because sometimes you don't feel like there's any way to also get that learning and teaching moment across. But I feel like it's almost always in how I handle that reaction.
It so is, isn't it? And when a child is pinging you, that term pinging, when they're sending out like a sonic ping, only it's a behavioral ping. One of the things that gives us that little bit of space that humor can come into it, or very assertive and very straight, or very quiet and gentle, doesn't matter what the response is. What matters most is that we're centered when we do it. And when we get pinged, we know if we can understand that we're being pinged, understand that a child's disoriented, they're not being disobedient, they're disoriented, they're looking to us for help. If we can ask ourselves, I wonder what's up with you. I wonder what's going on. I wonder. If we just wonder, in that moment, this is so wonderful, because if we wonder, then it gets us out of something. It's kind of magical in one sense, because it means we can no longer take it personally. As soon as you become inquisitive and not accusative, you no longer take it personally.
I use that tool at work, and
yes.
I call it curiosity over judgment.
Yes.
So if I'm wondering why something didn't get done properly, or something's really late, I have to remind myself, come at it from a place of curiosity first, as opposed to jumping to my own conclusions and judgment.
Curiosity. It didn't kill the cat. The curiosity is that kind of inquisitiveness. And one of the things I mentioned in the Being at Your Best book is this simple little sentence, because sometimes I think when things are going on, it has to be pretty simple with kids and in the workplace. And a simple sentence is to a child, can you help me understand? Mm. Can you help me understand why you're so mad at your brother? Can you help me understand what's so frustrating at the moment? Can you help Mama understand? And almost every child that I've ever seen, because they're such sweet little guys, such sweet little girls, will help you understand. And they'll say, well, he shouldn't have taken my, or he might say, well, it all began when he hit me back. Mm-hmm. And I'm just thinking, it all began when he hit you back, like American foreign policy. But but it's like, right? And out comes their little story, because it's usually the kid who retaliates that gets caught, right? So when kids have siblings, but that knowing we're getting pinged, really knowing that a kid's looking to us for direction, means we don't take it personally. And here's the bit that I actually really love, is that we don't have to have some fantastic answer. Like if we ask ourselves, I wonder what's going on with you. Just in that moment, our shoulders soften, our eyes soften, your face changes, your shoulders change. And because our kids are at their most vulnerable, they're also got their radar out and they're at their most perceptive. And they'll pick up that we're not going to be an angry, shouty dude. Mm-hmm. They'll pick up in that moment that we're wondering, and that will help them regulate. Right there, that will help them regulate. And it all comes from curiosity.
I love all of that. I think you are the first person to use the word ping. I always have called it like triggered, which might be a more powerful word, but ping, I like that. It takes the power out of the word triggered even. You have a podcast, you have a website. Tell us about all the goodies you have for us over on your site so we can get started in living the simplicity parenting life.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we have millennials on our staff. We have podcasts and courses and online courses and all sorts of like a community area. We've got all that sort of good stuff. It's just at simplicityparenting.com. That's, but we've got these short courses, free short courses. This new book, the Being at Your Best book, has a real deep dive 7-hour audio course for people who really want to get into self-regulation with their kids. So there's it, and kind of everything in between. Yeah, the podcast is amazing how many tens of thousands of people have accessed that and write in and getting help with that. It's, when you do a big project and then you find out that it actually is doing some good, it's really thrilling, right? Because you never quite know. Right.
It really is. Just hop right over to the Simplicity Parenting podcast. And if you want to go more in depth with Kim John Payne on topics like de-escalating with humor or the child-centered home versus value-centered home, or a lot of the things that we talked about here on this show, then you're going to find them over there at the podcast. And of course, we're going to pick up your new book. Thank you so much for all of this value and this time that you shared with us today.
Oh, it's been great to talk to you, actually. Thanks for your ideas too. They were great and lovely to chat.
Thanks so much for hanging out and listening to today's episode. If you were inspired by what you heard, I'd love if you shared it on social, give it a 5-star review on iTunes, and spread the word. But more than being inspired, I hope you're motivated to take action. Remember to just start. Take those steps today to get to where you want to be. And if you're ready to take your business to the next level, head on over to gethappypr.com and check out my agency and what we can do for you, or connect with me over on Instagram at Emily Rickett. That's Emily, Rickett. See you next time.